Desde la Universidad Militar Nueva Granada, en Bogotá, Colombia, transmite UMNG Radio. UMNG Radio. Una emisora alternativa, cultural e independiente. Desde la Universidad Militar Nueva Granada. Esta es UMNG Radio.
Lo que ocurre en la universidad, los acontecimientos y sus protagonistas están en UMNG Radio.
Tune in and speak up. Hello, English learners. Want to learn something interesting whilst having fun? Welcome to Tune In and Speak Up, the podcast where you'll get to know this beautiful language in depth. Each week, we'll dive into exciting topics, share practical tips, and tell you fascinating English language stories. So whether you're studying, going to work, or just relaxing, connect, listen, and let's make English part of your world. Wherever you are, whenever you want, just hit play, tune in and listen up. Tune in to UMNG Radio every Tuesday from 11 a.m. till noon. Don't just learn English, live it.
Desde el año 2022, la Universidad Militar Nueva Granada ha adoptado lo que ocurre en la universidad, los acontecimientos y sus protagonistas están en UMNG Radio.
Okay, good morning, everybody. Welcome to Tune In and Speak Up, the podcast from Universidad Militar Nueva Granada, where we explore curious stories, surprising facts, and cultural insights from around the world, all through the lens of English learning. This is the podcast where unusual moments from history and culture become your classroom for practicing English. I'm Jorge Bermúdez, teacher of English at the Department of Multicultural Studies at UMNG, part of the School of Education and Humanities. I'll be your guide through some of the most unexpected and thought-provoking topics, from forgotten inventions and everyday objects to strange ideas that quietly change the way we live. Whether you're learning English as a second language or simply enjoy discovering how culture and history shape our daily lives, this podcast is for you. So if you're ready to improve your listening skills, expand your vocabulary, and explore the hidden stories behind ordinary things, grab your headphones, tune in, and let's speak up. Today, we're beginning formally our third season with the history of the fork, how a simple tool changed civilization, as we can see in our slide. Remember that this season, our objective is to talk about everyday objects that have an extraordinary story. Okay, so let's begin. The objects we use every day often feel invisible. We hold them, use them, and rarely think about where they came from or why they exist in the form we know today. One of these objects is the fork. Small, simple, and familiar. It sits quietly beside our plates. Yet its journey into daily life was slow, controversial, and deeply connected to ideas about hygiene, manners, religion, and social class. For centuries, the fork was not welcome. It was criticized, mocked, and even feared. Some people believed it was unnecessary. Others believed it was unnatural. In certain places, it was seen as a symbol of excess and moral weakness rather than progress. The history of the fork is not only the story of an invention. It is the story of how societies change their habits, how new ideas challenge tradition, and how something ordinary can become a powerful symbol of civilization. In this episode, we will trace that story from ancient dining customs to the moment when a small metal utensil quietly reshaped the way people ate, behaved, and understood themselves at the table. Okay, so let's go to our first segment, Before the Fork, eating with hands, knives, and spoons. For most of human history, people did not eat with forks. In fact, for thousands of years, eating with your hands was not only normal, it was expected. The human hand was the first eating tool. Long before metal or ceramics, people used their fingers to pick up food, tear bread, and share meals. In many ancient societies, this was not considered dirty or uncivilized. Cleanliness meant something very simple: washing your hands before eating. As early civilizations developed, new eating tools slowly appeared. One of the earliest was the spoon. Archaeological evidence shows that spoons were already used in ancient Egypt more than 4,000 years ago. These early spoons were often made from wood, stone, or bone, and sometimes from precious materials like ivory. They were especially useful for eating soups, stews, and grains. The knife also became an important dining object, particularly in ancient Rome and medieval Europe. However, knives were not originally table utensils in the modern sense. They were personal tools. People carried their own knives, which they used for eating, working, and even self-defense. At the table, the knife was mainly used to cut food into smaller pieces, which were then eaten by hand. During the Middle Ages in Europe, meals were often communal. People shared large dishes placed at the center of the table. Plates, as we know them today, were uncommon. Instead, food was sometimes served on thick pieces of bread called trenchers. After the meal, these bread plates might be eaten or given to the poor. In this context, eating with your hands was practical and socially accepted. Table manners existed, but they were very different from modern rules. For example, medieval etiquette guides advised people not to wipe greasy hands on their clothes, not to reach across others, and not to lick their fingers too obviously. These rules show that manners were already important, but they did not require special utensils. What is especially important to understand is that hygiene did not mean distance from food. It meant control or behavior. Clean hands, modest movements, and respect for others at the table were more important than using tools. This way of eating was common not only in Europe but across much of the world. Even today, many cultures continue to eat with their hands, especially when sharing traditional meals. These practices are not signs of a lack of civilization. They reflect different ideas about comfort, community, and the relationship between the body and food. The fork, when it finally appeared, did not replace dirty habits. Instead, it challenged a long-established and perfectly functional way of eating, one that humans had trusted for centuries. And that takes us to our second segment, the first forks, Byzantium and the cultural shock of Europe. The fork did not appear suddenly in medieval Europe. Its earliest known use comes from the Byzantine Empire, the eastern continuation of the Roman world, where dining customs were already more elaborate than in Western Europe. By the 4th century, small two-pronged forks were being used at elite Byzantine tables. These early forks were not designed to replace hands completely. Instead, they helped people handle hot, sticky, or delicate foods. Made of gold, silver, or bronze, they were luxury objects closely associated with wealth and high status. In Byzantium, this kind of refinement was normal. Court life emphasized elegance, ceremony, and control of the body. Eating carefully without touching food directly matched these values. The fork fit naturally into this culture. However, when the fork traveled west, the reaction was very different. One of the most famous early moments occurred in the 11th century, when a Byzantine princess married into the Italian nobility. Historians point to two main candidates from medieval chronicles. Candidate 1, Maria Argyropulina. She is the most widely cited historical figure connected with introducing forks to Italy. Maria was a Byzantine noblewoman who married the son of the Duke of Venice around 1004. At her wedding feast in Venice, she used a two-pronged golden fork, which shocked and scandalized local society because dining with hands was the norm. Theologians like Peter Damian condemned her behavior as vanity and against natural eating customs. The second candidate is Theodora Anna Duquesna. Another version of the story names Theodora Anna Duquesna, a Byzantine princess married to the Duke of Venice, often cited in late 11th century context. Some accounts link her with introducing the fork at a Venetian wedding feast where guests protested its use as unnatural or irreligious. According to historical accounts, she brought forks with her and used them at the table. Instead of admiration, her behavior caused shock and criticism. So, as we are learning, many Western Europeans view the fork as unnecessary and even offensive. Touching food with metal prongs seemed artificial and excessive. Eating with clean hands was already considered proper, so the fork solved a problem that in their eyes did not exist. Religious attitudes made the reaction stronger. Some members of the clergy openly criticized the fork. They argued that God had given humans fingers to eat, and using metal tools showed pride and rejection of divine design. In religious writings of the period, forks were sometimes linked to vanity, luxury, and moral weakness. The fork also carried social meaning. Because it was rare and expensive, it became a symbol of elite behavior. For ordinary people, it represented distance from tradition and from shared communal life. Meals were meant to be social and physical experiences, not carefully controlled performances. As a result, for several centuries, the fork remained confined to small circles of wealth and influence. It did not spread because society was not ready for it. Cultural habits, religious beliefs, and ideas about the body all worked against its acceptance. What is important here is that the fork was not rejected because it was impractical. It was rejected because it challenged deep cultural values. It suggested that food, hands, and the human body needed separation, an idea that felt uncomfortable and even dangerous at the time. So the fork had arrived in Europe, but it would take many more years before it was truly welcome. Until, and that takes us to our third segment, Italy, pasta, and the turning point. Literally, as we can see in this picture, we're going to talk about spaghetti. For several centuries, the fork remained a curiosity, admired by few, rejected by many. That situation began to change in Italy, where daily eating habits slowly gave the fork a practical purpose. By the late Middle Ages, Italian cities such as Venice, Genoa, and Naples were centers of trade, wealth, and cultural exchange. Food culture in these regions was becoming more specialized, and one product in particular played a decisive role: pasta. Early forms of pasta had existed for centuries, but from around the 14th century, long, thin strands became increasingly popular in southern Italy. We're talking about spaghetti. Eating this kind of food with only fingers or a knife was difficult and messy. The spoon was not useful, and hands alone were inefficient. Here, the fork finally solved a real problem. Italian diners began to use small forks to hold pasta while cutting or twisting it. At first, these forks had two prongs, similar to earlier Byzantine models. Over time, their design changed. A third prong improved control, and eventually the four-pronged fork became standard, especially for handling long strands of pasta. This moment is crucial in the history of the fork. It stopped being only a symbol of luxury or refinement and became a useful dining tool. Once people experienced its convenience, resistance slowly weakened. The fork's acceptance in Italy was gradual but steady. It spread from aristocratic tables to merchants and urban households. As Italian dining customs gained influence across Europe, the fork traveled with them. By the 17th century, forks were common among the upper classes in France and England, often introduced through Italian cooks and courtly imitation. At this stage, the fork was no longer shocking. Instead, it became associated with order, cleanliness, and control at the table. What changed was not the fork itself, but the meaning attached to it. In Italy, it was no longer a foreign object challenging tradition. It was a practical response to new foods and new habits. This turning point shows an important pattern in cultural history. Inventions rarely succeed because they exist. They succeed because daily life creates a need for them. Pasta did not invent the fork, but it gave the fork a reason to stay. And that takes us to our next segment, the fork as a symbol of civilization. Once the fork became common in Italy, its meaning began to change across Europe. It was no longer only a practical tool for eating pasta. It slowly became a symbol of something much larger, civilized behavior. By the 17th and 18th centuries, European societies placed increasing importance on manners and self control, especially among the upper classes. Dining was no longer just about eating, it became a social performance guided by rules of etiquette. In this context, the fork played a new role. Using it correctly showed restraint and discipline. It reduced direct contact between the hands and food and helped diners eat neatly and quietly. Cleanliness was now associated not only with washing hands, but with controlling the body at the table. France, in particular, became a model for refined dining. At the royal court and among the nobility, table manners were carefully observed and taught. The fork, used together with the knife, became a visible sign of good upbringing and education. In England, similar changes followed. By the late 17th century, forks were increasingly present at formal meals. Instruction manuals and etiquette books explain how to use utensils properly and how to behave at the table. These rules did more than organize meals, they helped define social boundaries. People who used forks correctly were seen as polite and respectable. Those who did not were often judged as rude or uncultured. In this way, a simple utensil helped separate social classes. The fork also reflected changing ideas about hygiene. As medical knowledge slowly developed, distance from food was linked to health and cleanliness. Even if the scientific reasons were not fully understood, the fork represented progress and modern thinking. Over time, the fork became so deeply connected to these ideas that its absence felt strange. What had once been criticized as unnatural now seemed necessary. Civilization in many European minds had come to mean order, control, and refinement, and the fork fit perfectly into that vision. This transformation shows how objects can gain power beyond their original purpose. The fork did not only change how people ate, it changed how they judge one another. And that takes us to our segment 5, modern dining and cultural differences. By the time the fork became common in Europe, it was already connected to ideas of progress and good manners. As European influence expanded around the world, European dining customs spread with it. The fork traveled far beyond the continent where it had once been rejected. In the Americas, the fork arrived through colonization and migration. European table settings, including the fork and knife, became standard in formal meals and later in everyday life. Today, in many places, eating without a fork feels unusual, even though this habit is relatively recent in human history. In East Asia, however, a very different system developed. The widespread use of chopsticks here in the picture, we have fork, spoon, and in the middle we have a pair of chopsticks. The widespread of use of chopsticks is closely connected to how food is prepared. In Chinese, Japanese, and Korean cuisines, ingredients are usually cut into small, bite-sized pieces before cooking. Because food arrives at the table already prepared for eating, knives are unnecessary. Chopsticks allow people to pick up food gently and precisely without cutting. Cooking methods also played an important role. Stir frying and steaming produce soft, small pieces of food that are easy to handle with chopsticks. Large cuts of meat, common in medieval Europe, were far less typical at the table. Philosophy and values also shaped this practice. In Confucian thought, which strongly influenced East Asian cultures, the table is a place of harmony and respect. Knives were associated with violence and aggression, so the presence at the table was discouraged. Chopsticks, in contrast, symbolized calmness, control, and balance. Over time, using chopsticks became a learned skill and a cultural marker. It reflects patience, coordination, and social awareness rather than speed or strength. In South Asia, the Middle East, and parts of Africa, eating with the hands remains common, especially during traditional meals. This practice is not random or informal. It follows clear cultural and social rules. Hands are preferred because they create a direct sensory connection with food. Temperature, texture, and portion size can be felt immediately. This connection is valued as a more natural and mindful way of eating. Religious and cultural traditions also support this practice. In Hindu, Islamic, and many African food cultures, eating with the hands is associated with humility, gratitude, and shared experience. Strict rules about cleanliness, such as washing hands before and after meals, are central to these traditions. In communal meals, using hands reinforces equality. Everyone eats in the same way, from the same dishes, strengthening social bonds. These traditions show that civilization does not depend on tools. What matters is respect for others, attention to cleanliness, and understanding shared rules. The fork, chopsticks, and hands all represent different answers to the same human need, each developed in response to food, environment, belief systems, and social life. None is superior. Each tells a story about the culture that shaped it. And that takes us to our vocabulary segment. Before we close today's episode, let's review some of the keywords that helped shape the story of the fork and its cultural meaning. So, some useful vocabulary for today's episode. Utensil. Definition: a utensil is a tool used for cooking or eating. Forks, knives, spoons, and chopsticks are all utensils. Throughout this episode, the fork has been our main example of how a simple utensil can reflect cultural values. In a sentence, we can say, the fork is a common utensil that shows how culture influences the way people eat. Our second word for today, hygiene. Hygiene refers to practices that help keep people clean and healthy. In earlier societies, hygiene meant washing hands before meals. Later, using utensils like forks became connected to new ideas about cleanliness and health. In our example sentence, we have, in the past, good hygiene at the table meant washing your hands, not using special tools. Our third word, etiquette. Etiquette means the socially accepted rules of behavior. Table etiquette tells people how to sit, eat, and behave during meals. The fork became an important part of European dining etiquette in the early modern period. In our sentence example, we have table etiquette taught people how to behave properly during meals in early modern Europe. Sentence number 4. Invention. An invention is something created for the first time. The fork was an invention, but its success depended on whether people accepted it. This episode showed that inventions only survive when culture is ready for them. In our sentence, the fork was an invention that only became popular when people found it useful in daily life. Word number 5, dining. Dining refers to the act of eating, especially in a formal or social setting. Dining is never only about food. It reflects relationships, values, and ideas about respect and community. In our example sentence, we have, dining is a social activity that reflects cultural values, not just a moment to eat food. These words help us talk not only about food, but about history, culture, and everyday behavior. Understanding them allows us to describe how simple actions like eating can carry deep meaning. Okay, and now we're going to our closing reflection. The story of the fork reminds us that history is not only written in books, wars, or great inventions. It is also written in the small, quiet objects we use every day. For centuries, people ate perfectly well without forks. When the fork first appeared, it was not welcome as progress. It was resisted, criticized, and misunderstood. What changed was not human nature, but culture, habits, values, and ideas about the body, cleanliness, and respect. This journey shows that the way we eat is never just practical. It reflects how societies think about control and freedom, tradition and change, community and individuality. A fork, A pair of chopsticks or a hand is never only a tool. It is a cultural choice shaped by history. Understanding these everyday objects helps us understand one another. It teaches us that difference is not a problem to solve, but a story to learn from. What feels normal to one culture may feel strange to another, and both can be meaningful in their own way. As we begin this new season, we will continue exploring ordinary things with extraordinary histories. Objects that seem simple, familiar, and silent often have the most to say about who we are and how we live. Next week, we will have the answer to a question, and that question is, why do clocks run to the right? Okay, what is called clockwise. Okay, why? There is a very interesting story behind this. And throughout the season, we will be exploring everyday things like the mirror, the why coffee is so popular around the world. Okay, now I forgot all the other topics, but they are all very interesting and about very simple everyday things. Okay, so thank you so much for spending this time with me on Tune In and Speak Up, the podcast from Universidad Militar Nueva Granada. I hope you enjoyed our journey through the history of the fork and discovered how even the most ordinary objects can carry deep cultural meaning. If this episode helped you see everyday life a little differently, or helped you connect language with history and culture in a new way, then this episode has done exactly what it was meant to do. Learning English is not only about grammar or vocabulary. Understanding how people live, think, and express values through simple actions. This season, we will continue exploring unusual yet meaningful topics that reveal the strong connection between language, history, and daily experience. Each episode is designed to help you improve your listening skills, expand your vocabulary, and develop a deeper awareness of how culture shapes communication. If you found today's episode useful or interesting, feel free to share it with your classmates, friends, or fellow English learners. Learning becomes stronger when it is shared, discussed, and experienced together. And if you'd like to share your thoughts, reflections, or feedback, we would truly love to hear from you. Your ideas help us grow, and your voice helps shape future episodes. This podcast exists for learners like you, curious, thoughtful, and committed to improving step by step. We'll be back next week with another topic that may surprise you, make you reflect, or inspire new conversations in English. Until then, keep listening, keep practicing, and most importantly, keep exploring the world through language. And as always, keep speaking up. Until next time, Leonardo, thank you very much.
Desde la Universidad Militar Nueva Granada, en Bogotá, Colombia, transmite UMNG Radio. UMNG Radio. Una emisora alternativa, cultural e independiente. Desde la Universidad Militar Nueva Granada. Esta es UMNG Radio.